Okay, so in this screencast, we're going to look at our second market structure, which is monopoly. Probably a market structure, at least some of the basic ideas behind this market structure, many of you are going to be familiar with. So we're going to look at doing three things today. We're going to talk about what is kind of the cause of monopoly. Why do monopolies exist? Second, how do monopolies operate and function? Okay, especially compared to perfect competition. And then finally, what, if anything, should the government do about monopolies? So let's start off with why do monopolies exist? Okay, so a monopoly exists because, well, let's take a step back. A firm in a competitive market is considered to be a price taker, right? Okay, in a monopoly, the firm is a price maker. They create the market price. Okay, perfect competition. The firm is so tiny relative to the market that they have to take the market price. Supply and demand creates the market price. In a monopoly, the firm is the market. Why? It's the only seller of its product, and there are no close substitutes for that product. So why do monopolies exist? Why do monopolies arise? Well, really, the fundamental cause of a monopoly is a barrier to entry. And barriers to entry is anything that prevents a competitor from entering the marketplace, anything that would prevent more competition from joining the market. And there are really three or four, kind of depends on how you look at it, basic barriers to entry. And we're going to look at each of these in a little bit more detail. First is going to be ownership of a key resource. Second is going to be a government-created monopoly. And then third is what we call a natural monopoly, or when the costs of production actually make it more advantageous for one firm to produce the output than many firms to produce the output. So monopoly over a resource occurs if one company gets control of a natural resource or a resource used in the production of a good that allows them to actually have market power over that product. So probably the most famous example of this is called the De Beers Corporation. This is a large South African company that has not perfect monopoly power over the diamond market, but pretty close to perfect monopoly power over the diamond market. They control a vast majority of the world's diamond mines, about 80% of the world's diamond mines, which gives them so much power that they can actually set the price by limiting the quantity. Another example, smaller company, but one that's still out there, is called Perrier, I don't know the spelling here, Spring Water. It's a French company. They own one spring in France. It's a mineral spring that has a very distinct, very unique mineral water. They're the only company that's allowed to bottle that water. They're the only company that's allowed to sell that water, so they have a monopoly over that particular mineral water. Now, a government-created monopoly occurs when the government sells or gives exclusive right to sell a product to one company. So one form of government-created monopoly is patents and copyrights. So patents are the exclusive right to sell an invention. Copyrights are the exclusive right to sell intellectual property, like music, movies, or songs. Music, movies, or books. Okay? The government does this in order to give inventors and creators an incentive to create their product. Okay? So patents are created so that way when I invent a product, I actually then have an incentive, I can make money selling it, to create more products. Same thing with copyrights. Another form of government-created monopoly is called a franchise. Okay? This is when one company pays the government for the exclusive right to sell a product. So an example of this would be Aramark has a franchise on cafeteria services at Plainfield South High School. So they paid the Plainfield School District to have the exclusive right to sell you cafeteria food. As a result, they get to determine the price and the type of food that's being served in the cafeteria. We'll talk a little bit more about that in class. The third type of monopoly is called a natural monopoly. Natural monopolies occur when one firm can produce the good cheaper than many firms. It's actually less expensive for one firm to produce the output than it is for many firms to produce the output. This happens in industries like water, municipal water I'm talking about, electricity, and landline phones. So if you think about it, so a great example of a natural monopoly would be a electric company, where the fixed costs make up the majority of the cost, and the more that they produce, the cheaper it is to actually produce. So natural monopoly, one firm can produce the output or cheaper than many firms can, and this happens because average total costs fall as output is rising. Okay, and this is a result of large fixed costs of production. Okay, when the fixed costs of production make up a significant amount of the costs, you're going to have average total costs fall even as output is rising. Now, a little bit about how monopoly functions. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit of a refresher course. So for a monopoly, total revenue is going to be price times quantity. Average revenue will be total revenue divided by quantity, or average revenue will be equal to price, right? And marginal revenue is the change in total revenue over the change in quantity. Now, here's where a monopoly is different, okay? For a competitive firm, demand is perfectly elastic because it's just one tiny little firm in a great big huge market with free entry and free exit. For a monopoly, demand slopes downward, okay? So the demand curve actually slopes downward because the monopoly is the market. There's no other market demand curve we're going to look at. The monopoly is the market demand curve. And what that means is for the monopoly, marginal revenue is actually going to be less than average revenue. So the formula for marginal revenue is the change in total revenue over the change in quantity, right? So to find my marginal revenue, I'm going to look at how much my total revenue changes when my quantity changes. So as I go from 0 units to 1 unit, my total revenue goes up by 10, my marginal revenue is 10. From 1 to 2, my quantity goes up by 1, my total revenue goes up by 8. 2 to 3, my quantity goes up by 1, but my marginal revenue is 6. It's going to be 4, 2, 0, -2, -6. Okay? So what happens with the monopoly is, so the monopolist marginal revenue curve is always going to be less than the price of the good. And this occurs because the demand curve is going to be downward sloping, right? To sell more of the product, to sell one more unit, they're going to have to lower the price. So because of that, because the price is lower and total revenue is price times quantity, as your quantity increases, your total revenue is going to change, okay? Now, what that's going to look like is this. So here's going to be my demand curve. There's going to be my marginal revenue curve. Now, if you guys notice on this graph, the marginal revenue is going to actually slope negative at about 5 units. Between 5 and 6 units, marginal revenue is going to go negative. This happens because we're dealing with a linear demand curve, okay? This top portion is elastic. Right here is going to be my unit elastic portion, and down here will be my inelastic portion. So what that means for the monopoly is lowering price will raise revenue up until they get to the unit elastic portion. And if they continue to lower price, their revenue is actually going to start falling. Okay. If you're confused about this, you can look back over the chapter 5 notes when we talked about the relationship between elasticity and total revenue. Now, the monopolist is going to, like the competitive firm, maximize profit by producing wherever marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Except for the monopolist, marginal revenue is less than price. So what's going to happen is you're going to actually mark up to the price line. What that's going to look like is this. Okay? So the monopolist is going to choose a quantity where MR equals MC. Okay, that'll be quantity A right here. However, they're not going to charge quantity A. What they're going to do is they're going to mark the price up to the demand curve right here. And the reason they're going to do that is because they can, right? Why does a monopolist mark up the price? Because they can. They have market power. As a result, a monopolist is going to charge a price that's going to be significantly higher than its marginal cost of production. The monopolist is going to charge more than it costs them to produce the good or service. And as a result of that, the monopolist is often going to be able to earn positive economic profit, right? And to find monopoly profit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the average revenue, which will be the price. I'm going to subtract from it the average total cost, which would be right here. So you first find the quantity where MR equals MC, mark up to the price line, okay? And then multiply this all by the quantity sold. And that'll give me my monopoly profit. So like, let's say for example, my monopoly price is $6 a unit, my average total cost is $3 a unit, and I sell 100 units. My monopoly profit would be 3 times 100, it'd be $300. Now, in a competitive firm, I would anticipate new companies are going to go ahead and enter this market and drive profits down to zero. But in monopoly, because of those barriers to entry we had talked about, new firms can't enter the market, and the monopoly will continue to earn positive economic profit. Price is greater than ATC, average total cost. Monopoly will continue to earn positive economic profits. Now let's talk briefly about the cost of monopoly, the welfare cost of monopoly, okay? So unlike competition, the monopoly charges a price that exceeds its marginal cost of production, okay? From the standpoint of consumers, the high price is really undesirable. However, from the standpoint of the firm, okay, the monopoly is actually going to be very desirable, right? So monopoly, consumers lose, but producers gain. So we can't necessarily mark up all monopoly profit as deadweight loss, okay? However, there is going to be some deadweight loss. And the reason is because the monopoly can mark up the price. They're going to produce a quantity short of the socially optimal quantity. The socially optimal quantity is always going to be where supply equals demand. Because the monopoly marks up the price, they're going to produce a quantity short of the socially optimal. So the socially optimal quantity would be where MR equals MC. That would be this point right here. Okay. However, the monopolist is going to produce, the socially optimal quantity would be where supply equals demand, which would be this point right here. However, the monopoly is going to produce where MR equals MC. And they're going to mark up the price, okay? And there's going to be this wedge, which is going to be deadweight loss. So monopolies do impose a cost on society, and the cost is the fact that some consumers end up getting driven out of the market because of the artificially high monopoly price, because the monopoly engages in markup here because they can. Now, the monopolist is going to produce less than the socially efficient quantity. The deadweight loss of a monopoly is similar to the deadweight loss caused by a tax. The difference is in a tax, okay, the benefits go to the government and then indirectly to everyone in the form of government services, okay, where a monopoly, the benefits go to a private firm. And this is a significant part of the reason why people worry about monopoly power. Okay, this is a significant part of the reason why monopolies are often looked down upon, because they use their market power to extract excess profit, or in economics that's called rent, excess economic rent from the public. What should we do about monopolies? How should the government approach monopolies? Monopolies are generally looked down upon. They charge a price that's too high. They produce a quantity that's too low. They cause deadweight loss. They prevent new firms from entering the market. There's all kinds of negatives associated with a monopoly. Okay, So there are kind of four basic approaches the government can take towards how to respond to a monopoly. And each of them have some advantages and some disadvantages. So the first is to try to make them more competitive using antitrust law. The second approach is to try to regulate their behavior. This is most prevalent with natural monopolies. The third approach is to use antitrust law, or excuse me, to take them over. And the fourth approach is to do nothing. And we'll talk about why doing nothing would sometimes make sense. So, antitrust laws allow the government to do all kinds of different things. They can prevent mergers, they can break up companies, and they can prevent companies from performing activities that make markets less competitive. We're going to talk about this in a little more detail when we talk about oligopolies. Okay, so there are some great examples of each of these. Preventing mergers, government recently prevented a merger between T-Mobile and AT&T. Okay, breaking up companies, probably the most famous example is Standard Oil. And we'll talk about, again, in oligopolies, when the government might prevent things like collusion or firms acting together. Now, there are two important pieces of antitrust law. There's the Sherman Act of 1890, which limited the power of what were called trusts at the time. Trusts were really monopolies. They were holding companies that controlled markets. Okay, and then the Clayton Act of 1914, which allowed private lawsuits. This is an important aspect of the Clayton Act. What it did is it strengthened the Sherman Act, and it said that if you were a private entity that was negatively affected by a monopoly, you could actually sue for damages. You can sue the monopolist, and you could actually get punitive damages to prevent them from engaging in things like price gouging. Now, regulation is most often used with natural monopolies. So when average total costs fall, even as output is rising. Okay, and what the government wants to do is they want to set a price equal to marginal cost. However, this is actually very problematic for a natural monopoly. Okay, so in practice, what ends up happening is the government, the regulators, actually allow the monopolists to keep some of the benefits. And the reason they do this is if the government actually forced companies to price the good at the point where the price equals the marginal cost, because average total cost is falling, don't forget average costs fall until it crosses marginal cost. Here, marginal cost really low. That's one of the aspects of a natural monopoly. If they had to set the price equal to marginal cost, the firm would actually end up losing money. Okay, the firm would actually end up taking losses. So what will often happen with regulation is the government will actually set the price equal to average total cost, and then they'll use private funds to subsidize the consumers who end up being unable to afford the product. So these would be consumers that can't afford the product. The government would actually subsidize those consumers. A great example of this would be the market for electricity. Here in Illinois, the market for electricity really isn't a free market. So Commonwealth Edison is really the monopoly provider of electricity. The government of Illinois actually regulates the price ComEd can charge for their electricity. They don't quite price it equal to marginal cost. They tend to price it more closer to average total cost. And again, this is the legislature that actually sets the price. And then they give consumers a subsidy to help them pay for their electric bill. Now, sometimes the government might actually find it beneficial to run the monopoly itself. A great example of this is the post office. Okay. Another great example of this is municipal water supplies, where the government says it's just too vital, just too essential to leave it to a private enterprise. We want to ensure that the municipal water supply is clean, is readily available, and that we have good sewage and sanitation systems. Therefore, we'll just run it ourselves. It's cheaper and easier for the government to run itself and take it over. And then the fourth approach the government can take is to do nothing. And this most often happens when the cost of the monopoly is less than the cost of intervention. So if the monopoly is costing you less, if it would cost you more to intervene in the market than the monopoly is causing you in dead weight loss, it's often to the government's benefit to do nothing. So a great example of this is in the 1990s, the government sued Microsoft 2 times to break it up. They were going to break it up into 4 companies. But what happened is, as the 90s wore on, and it's very hard for monopolies to maintain monopolies forever, especially in things like technology, new firms entered, and Microsoft's ability to mark up its prices began to decrease. So in both instances in the 1990s, the government actually ended up abandoning its lawsuits because it found that it wasn't really going to benefit consumers at all to break up Microsoft into smaller companies. So one monopoly pricing practice that we need to talk about for just a minute is price discrimination. This is the tactic of charging consumers different prices based on their willingness to pay. Okay, so no 2 consumers will pay the same price for the same good. Now, monopolies can do this because they have market power and there aren't close substitutes for their goods. Okay, in order to price discriminate, though, couple of things have to happen. Number 1, the firm has to have market power. Number 2, you have to be able to divide the customers up into based on their willingness to pay. You have to have some way of dividing customers up based on their willingness to pay. And finally, you have to be able to prevent somebody who pays a lower price from reselling the good to somebody else. Okay? So you have to have market power. You have to be able to divide consumers up based on their willingness to pay. And you have to be able to prevent resale in order to price discriminate. Now, in practice, what happens for price discrimination is 2 things. Number 1, it's going to increase monopoly profit. Number 2, it'll actually reduce dead weight loss. So, here we have a monopolist with a single price. Currently, their price is equal to their marginal revenue. Currently they produce where MR equals MC. They mark up the price. They earn profit equal to the gray shaded area. The blue shaded area is consumer surplus, and the pink shaded area is dead weight loss. Now, if this same firm were able to perfectly price discriminate, that means charge each consumer exactly what their willingness to pay. Okay? Every customer would pay a different price. So it would be right on the demand curve. And what would happen is the entire area would become monopoly profit. Okay? The entire area would become monopoly profit. Now, perfect price discrimination is rare. However, there is lots of price discrimination in the economy. I'll give you a few examples. Movie tickets are a form of price discrimination. So there's senior discounts, there's student discounts, there's matinees. You pay a higher price if you want to see it in 3D. You may pay a higher price to have a reserved seat. Airline tickets are a great example, probably my favorite example. Airlines are very, very good at differentiating between business travelers and vacation travelers. And business travelers pay significantly more than vacation travelers. And the way they do that is actually what days you fly on. So traditionally, business flyers fly on Monday, and they fly home on Friday. So if you are willing to stay over a weekend, you actually pay significantly less to fly than if you fly out on a Monday and fly back on a Friday. Coupons are an example. Quantity discounts like Costco or Sam's Club are a great example of price discrimination. And then finally, financial aid. Financial aid is probably as close an example of perfect price discrimination as you can come. Because in order to qualify for financial aid, they really are going to find out your willingness and ability to pay, because you have to fill out a FAFSA form, which is going to turn over your tax information to the school that you're going to. Now, kind of in conclusion, firms with monopoly power are common, some monopoly power. Okay, most firms have some control over their price. However, Firms with pure monopoly power are actually exceedingly rare. Perfect competition is a very rare market structure. Monopoly is a very rare market structure because there are few goods that are truly unique. There are few goods that really don't have a substitute.